All right.
So maybe I'd give it till
Yes,
11:02.
I will wait another minute.
Do we need computer out?
No. And you'll be getting, there's links where you can actually download copies of the stuff I'll have on the screen as well. So, if there's something that you feel is important to you, you'll be able to access it, look at it again. And I'm gonna do some house cleaning. Everybody, if you could please, if you're in the room with me here, please silence your phone. I'm old, I get distracted easily, and so ringing phone is problematic for me. Bad enough, I listened to my phone through my hearing aids, and I've got my phone on silent, but it still rings in my ears, right? When you can't figure it out. And then we've got an awful lot of stuff to go through. I haven't timed out how much time all this is going to take me. So at least for the time being, if you have specific questions, save them either until the end or text me offline and answer your question. Take care of it that way. And what we are going to be covering today, kind of three different topics. One, I want to introduce you to some of the new laws that have gone into effect in California this year. Actually, one of them kicks in January 2024. I want to go through some random risk management topics that I think are important and pertinent today. And last but not least, we have a whole bunch of new and or modified zip forms, car forms, that I want to go through with you and talk about some of the changes. Most of them they've added a paragraph, they've added a sentence here or there. Some of the new forms are kind of timely. The most important one pertains to buyer broker agreements. And those are going to be very important in the next few years to come, when California is likely to legislatively become a state where we have to use buyer brokers. So not too big of a change for the time being, but in the future it will be. So with that said, first subject I want to cover are the new laws that have to effect in California. I should tell you before I cover these, there were actually several. Who's got a phone on?
Turning it off now.
See, if you would have gotten here on time, you would have heard me warn everybody about turning their phones on. Okay. There were actually several more laws that went into effect this year, but the ones that I'm not going to talk to you about pertain to property management law. We don't do property management for KW, with the exception of two brokers who do property management under their own license, not under the license of our KW office. So I won't be addressing those new laws. But the first one I wanted to talk about was SB 1495. And what that did, part of the law really doesn't pertain to you because you are already licensed. There's a large chunk of this law that changed. The purpose of it was to change the material requirements or the course requirements for the real estate practices course, which you probably all remember is one of those courses you have to take in order to get your real estate license. And the changes that they added to that real estate practices course. What was that? No, because I don't want the noise from the outside. Part of that change in the real estate practices course is they added a requirement for a section on implicit bias and the impact that it has on consumers. And they added a section on federal and state fair housing law. Now, for those of you who are renewing your salesperson or broker's licenses, you are finding that those sections have been expanded upon quite extensively in the continuing education that you now have to take to renew your license. So that is kind of relevant there. But the reason that I wanted to talk about this change for you guys specifically is because if you are applying for a fictitious business name, and I know a couple of you in the room have been or are, they are changing the publication period that they are requiring from 30 to 45 days. So if you're already in process, then you're already under whatever the requirements were at that time. But ongoing in the future, you're going to have to comply with that longer publication period before you can submit that fictitious business name, or at least before DRE will approve it. All right. AB 2745. This is relevant to probably many of you, maybe if not now, then at some point in the future. They are changing the experience requirement. Actually, it has been changed. If you want to sit for California real estate brokers exam, and the change they're doing does not pertain to real estate sales experience. You are all doing that every day. What it pertains to is a lot of agents will add non-licensed experience, trying to buffer up that experience that they use to satisfy the broker's exam requirement. What they're doing now is they're just saying if you're using non-licensed experience, it has to be within 5 years of your application date. So not going to affect too much of you, at least not that. Like you can make it.
I stuck up those again.
AB 2960, another one effective this year. Hold on, we got to run it.
You're not gonna comment on
Huh? Glad you all could make it.
Hey, we're
Please
here,
take a
bro.
seat.
that? We're here.
Realize I'm an old Marine and I live by my watch, right?
And the code.
Can you do me a favor and shut the door? Thanks. All right, make sure your phones are silent. AB 2960. This is kind of an important one, and it affects all of us. What they did with 2960 is, when you might be in the middle of a transaction, and let's just say you're representing, well, it doesn't matter, representing the seller or the buyer. And in the middle of the transaction, the state passes a new law that may change, whatever the disclosure requirements were. Well, there's always been this uncertainty if you're a real estate agent in one side or the other of the transaction, what laws are going to affect this transaction? So AB 2960 basically took the uncertainty out of which law is going to impact that transaction. And it basically says at the time the contract is ratified, whatever law is in place on that day, that's the disclosure requirement that will apply to the transaction. Now, that said, if you're representing a buyer or seller in a transaction and a new law kicks in that is more disclosure friendly, that gives more of an opportunity to disclose something that maybe wasn't disclosed before, my recommendation is always disclose more. You will never be harmed, at least not in the courtroom, for disclosing more than you should. All right, SB 1005. This one applies when you're dealing with a guardian or a conservator who is selling a home. And that home happened to have been the property of the conservatee. And it was the conservatee's present or former personal residence. And what this law says, what this law did, is it defined the requirements that the court must follow in a partition action of that property. Is there anybody that does not know what a partition action is? Okay, partition action pertains to properties that are held in a joint type of manner, tenants in common, joint tenants, things like that. And essentially it's when one of the owners is trying to pull back their portion of the property and separate it from the other person or her sons. Now generally, just as a kind of a general rule, courts will not normally force a partition in a way that separates, divides the property up and creates two new properties. What they will typically do is they will order a forced sale of the property and a division of the assets from the sale.
So, clarification around that. So you have husband and wife. Husband passes away. Wife wants to sell her portion.
We're not talking about that. What we're talking about here is where there is a guardian or a conservator, guardians and conservators fall under the probate code, but this is not a probate situation.
Got
This is a situation with a living.
maybe dimensions in place, or something like that. They can't authorize their signatures because they want to sell their portion of the property.
They say the more realistic situation is the conservator or the guardian wants to sell the property or wants to partition the property in order to get money to fund long-term memory care or something like that. That's probably more of a real life circumstance. And what this did is it clarified what the courts are able to do in terms of that. I love this one. This is out of all the new laws that have passed this year. AB 1410.
Tell us more.
You're right. For those of you who don't know this, homeowners associations, not just in California, but throughout the country, are extremely powerful. People go up, they try to go up against their HOAs routinely, and this is all over the place. And ultimately, those people will spend a lot of money on lawyers, and they generally lose. And there are generally sanctions from the HOAs that affect those people. And what AB 1410 did, I think this is solely a result of the whole social media thing with Yelp and Facebook and all that. AB 1410 is kind of like the free speech against HOAs. It prohibits the governing docs of an HOA from prohibiting members and residents from discussing their common interest development on social media, including bad-mouthing the association report. So they can't prohibit, if you go and blast them on, blast the board of directors on Facebook, yeah, they can't fine you or say you can't access the club, whatever it is they might go after you. Now, that said, if you are going to post something on social media and you are naming specific people or naming an organization, you want to make sure that you're not defaming. So they're not public figures, and if you are telling things that are untrue about them publicly, you're defaming. And that could be sanctioned. And then AB 1410 also clarifies a 2020 law that, and this is important, for you guys when you're representing buyers and sellers to know, particularly, they have a specific purpose that they're buying a home. Required an HOA, so the law in 2020 required HOAs to allow at least 25% of the units to be rented out. But people started taking advantage of that. People started doing, 1 week rentals or weekend rentals and things of that nature. And so the law needed to be clarified. So what has now been clarified is that when an owner wants to rent out just a room or a portion of his owner occupied unit for more than 30 days, then the HOA cannot enforce a prohibition against it. But if it's going to be rented out to somebody for less than 30 days, the HOA still has control over that.
So if it's a long-term tenant, no provisions there.
Correct.
And
The
if
goal, if it's short term, then the HOA has authority. I think the goal is, we have such a housing shortage in California, and if any of you have kids, you know how expensive it is for somebody to be able to afford an apartment or a house to rent or whatever. And I think this is a way of kind of bridging a little bit of that gap in the housing shortage in California. The state has acted on it.
You think the HOA, I'm just curious, your opinion, they do this basically to discourage Airbnbs?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the only conclusion I can draw.
Yeah, that's
Right.
exactly it.
So, well, I guess it'd be HOA specific if they would consider a room being rented out. Let's say you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, rent out one room. They're not qualifying that as one of the 25% units being rented out,
No, they're not.
because you're still owner occupied.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bruce, if I may, please, your opinion. I actually visited Arizona HOA 30 days. I have a friend of mine who lives in Thomas Park, and the neighbor Airbnb's the house. For the most part, it's been okay. He hasn't said anything. There's been a couple issues with people coming and going. If because he called me, he asked my opinion. If he contacted the HOA, do you have any idea what the process would be, like briefly?
I'll confess, I live in the Thomas Park.
Yeah.
And I have no idea the answer to
Yeah. So I wonder just how intrusive or how strict the HOA would get involved in making sure that.
I think that's probably the HOA specific.
Yeah.
that. Frankly, the HOA board of directors for the Thomas Park, in my experience, is so radicalized. I try to stay out of their matters because I want plausible.
One more thing.
The next couple of laws, and these are the final ones that I wanted to talk about.
You didn't talk about the emergencies there. Last, prevents HOA from pursuing enforcement action for violations during declared emergency. Or is that?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. What that means is, if there's a declared emergency, let's just say
The fires.
the fires happened or the levee broke and flooded in Thomas and there's a state of emergency enacted. They can't enforce prohibitions against packing, 10 people into a 3-bedroom house.
Oh.
Temporarily. Just like you might recall when we had the last big.
Crowd fire.
Sorry, finished. Don't get it
Sorry.
wrong. It's fine. Sorry. You might recall a couple of years ago when we were really acting on our water shortages. And, in the Thomas Park, you looked around the lawns and they were all going brown and
Right.
Yeah.
or whatever. Well, that was because they were prohibited against acting, trying to enforce the rules of the association. It's the same type of thing.
Right.
The next couple I'm going to talk about, they deal with foreclosure law. And you might ask, well, why are we talking about foreclosure law today? It's because we are seeing an uptick in the number of notice of defaults. We're seeing an uptick in the numbers of foreclosures. It's nothing like it was in 2007, 2008, 2009, way back in those days. But that's not to say it can't continue to increase. So the state has acted on this, and the first one is Assembly Bill 1837. Yeah. So that basically refers back to Senate Bill 1079. And what that did is it allowed existing tenants, prospective owner occupants, nonprofits and local governments, up to 45 days after a trustee sale to make an offer that meets the winning bid. Now, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that. Those of us in California, the type of foreclosure that occurs here is called a non-judicial foreclosure sale. It means if you're being foreclosed on here, you're not going to be sued in court. It's handled outside of the court by a trustee who manages that loan. And the trustee is empowered with what's called a power of sale, so that they can, after certain requirements are met, they can hold a trustee sale at the courthouse steps or at a designated location. And if somebody shows up there with, the minimum bid and it's not bid up, they can secure that property. That's called a trustee sale here in California. In other states, they have what's known as, not all other states, but many of the other states, they have what's called a judicial foreclosure. And in a judicial foreclosure, the bank basically files a lawsuit in court against the homeowner, the mortgagor. And it takes usually many months. And then at the end of that foreclosure, when it's all said and done, they will have the sale. But after the sale, the buyer usually has a right of redemption that lasts a certain period of time. Might be 30 days, it might be 6 months. What that means is if the, let's say, buyer has the former homeowner has a right of redemption. And if they can come up with the total debt that the bank has lost during that period of time, they are allowed to redeem the property and they take possession again, or they get ownership again. So what California has done is basically they've initiated almost a redemption after the sale, except this is not for the former mortgage or the former owner. This is for people like a tenant that was living in the property or somebody that wants to occupy the property as an owner occupant. What's been excluded here are investors. And when they talk about nonprofits and local governments, they're talking about a lot of entities out there that their goal is to help veterans get into housing, things like that. And we saw a lot of that stuff going on, even 3-4 years ago, where the banks, like I'll use Chase as an example, when they acquired a foreclosed property, they had an arrangement where they were giving the first opportunity to acquire those properties over to veterans organizations. And then those organizations would do some repairs and sell it to gift it to a veteran. So that's the first part of this thing. Then there's AB 1837.
Oh, you're on 1837.
Yeah, 1837, which clarifies and modifies the types of nonprofit entities that qualify as those eligible bidders. And it actually disallows certain LLCs and all limited partnerships from bidding. And why did that happen? Because what we began to see previously is that we had a lot of smart investors and they were saying, oh, gee, let me form this LLC or this limited partnership. And I'll say that, for example, I'm going to run my business for the benefit of veterans. And then they would be able to get on a list for like Chase Bank and get some of their property. Well, it was a sham and they were profiting on it quite a bit. And that's why I think the state stepped in and modified that to exclude certain types.
So it says up to 45 days after the foreclosure. After that, everything opens up. So let's say the home is on 123 Main Street, went up for auction. There was no bid on it.
That's correct.
45 days after, those LLCs or limited partnerships or whatever are then allowed to bid on that property.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's probably if you've ever worked with Fannie Mae, selling properties or, any of these other major banks, a lot of them already had that process in place where they would say for the first 15 days, you can only be an owner occupant, nonprofit or government entity.
So auction takes place inside those 45 days. I agree, Gibbons can go purchase this property for say $300,000 and then assume it just as an owner occupant.
Yes.
right? I'm not limited to that.
Yes, but let me caution you, since you brought it up, Rich Gibbons.
No, what I do.
You as an individual, or you as an agent representing, working with a buyer, you want to stay away from recommending they try to acquire a property at a trustee sale. That is a game that is for people that are experienced and know what they're doing. And you can really lose your shirt really easily doing it because, number one, the biggest reason is when you acquire a property at a trustee sale, you acquire it without the benefit of being able to get title insurance. That's number one.
Right, so there may be cloud or lien on title.
So yes, you most likely have never been inside the property. You don't know what the former owner has done. I foreclosed on properties before where the former owner had dumped bags of cement down the toilet. I've heard of other circumstances similar to that. I know of a case on a loan that my old savings and loan that I foreclosed for years ago. On the day of the trustee sale, the former owner drove his truck through the front of the house. You know, it's very dangerous to the buyer bidding at a trustee sale. And then of course you have the risk that there are predatory investors that will form groups, and they will try to drive up the bid price so that only one of their little group can get it, which of course is also antitrust and illegal, but it happens.
It happens.
So, yeah, so stay away from trustees.
Bruce. Does 1837, as I read it, does that eliminate an arm's length transaction? Because it talks about like prospective owner occupants.
You're talking arm's length. You're talking about it, I think, in the context of prior to the trustee. Right?
No, I'm thinking more after, like a property actually forecloses. And let's just say if it's the market and it was owned, I'll just say it was owned by me, but my brother wants to buy it cash today at the market. Remember, there was a whole arm's length, et cetera. Does
I don't
1837,
think 1837 is gonna prohibit that. There may be other laws that would, but I don't think 1837. And then AB 2170, that's another post trustee law. So it basically provides an initial 30-day window for eligible bidders to purchase REO properties from bank, but it only affects institutions that foreclose on 100 or 175 or more per year. And it requires that for the first 30 days after the sale, after the trustee sale, they only accept offers from owner-occupied, qualified nonprofit government entities, and other affordable housing providers. And that's very similar to 1837. Clear? All right. Next thing we are going to go over are, I want to discuss some risk management tips. I think I said this when we had a lot fewer people in the room. Some of this stuff is, I think it's common sense. But I just wanted to run these things by you to think about and to put into your daily real estate practice. So first of all, keep in mind, you know, if we've been in the business for any length of time, we've seen shifting markets. Sometimes it's a buyer's market, sometimes it's a seller's market. But when you get into a situation where buyers start thinking, well, you know, gee, maybe I actually overpaid for this. That's when they also start thinking about other things, especially when, you know, they move in after a tough negotiation and all of a sudden they discover their dishwasher doesn't. Or it's 110 degrees in the summer and they turn on their air conditioning, it doesn't work, and you know, it looks like the condenser's not starting. You know, whatever it is. That's when they start thinking, well, gee, I'm a little pissed off. I think the seller might have ripped me off, didn't disclose that there was a defect. You know, and those are the kind of situations where they start to pursue litigation. So So the first thing I just wanted to say is, and I think I told a bunch of you, I've been in business a long time. And I probably, in total, I probably handled a couple thousand transactions. I personally have been sued once for something involving one of my transactions. It was a sham lawsuit involving a Fannie Mae REO and an allegation made by a squatter, and it was thrown out. So I've always taken the approach, I try to think about the optics. What do I mean by the optics? I mean, think about how something you did in the way you conducted yourself in a transaction might be viewed by a third party if you were describing what you did, say at a deposition or in front of a jury. And the example I include here on this slide is, say you list a property for sale, and you convince the seller to exclude it from the MLS for 14 days, so that you can pitch their home to your private group of investors. 2 days later, there's a contract that you presented to the seller. The seller accepts it on your recommendation. You're double ending the deal. And it closes escrow. And later, the seller discovers that your buyer, the buyer sent you an offer, and they accepted an offer for $50,000 less than fair market value, because their neighbor's house just went on the market and sold for $50,000. So whether you did or didn't do something unethical doesn't matter in this case. It's the optics. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that if you're going to be involved in a transaction like that, you should have something in your transaction file that references that you did in fact have a conversation with your client. You maybe gave them a market analysis that showed this is actually the fair market value of the property right now. Now, it may very well be that the seller, they had to have money quickly. They had to have a quick growth. And the best way to do that, after full disclosure to them, was to get it out to your investor list and see if there's an investor that wanted to take it, close escrow in 10 days. Okay, that might have been the best solution. But if that's the case, you want to have something in your transaction file to document that. This is the reason why we listed at this price. This is the reason why we sold at this price. And here is the market analysis that I gave to the seller before we listed it, showing what the actual fair market value was. That basically takes the problem away from the optics of just the oral statement of, Mr. Agent, why did you list and sell it for $50,000 below the fair market value? You have the answer. So think about the optics in what you do. If you're another example, and this happens, auditing transaction files, I see this fairly often. You, Mr. or Mrs. Agent, find an opportunity out there for a property, and it's not listed yet, or say it's a for sale by owner. And you go out there and you say, man, I want to buy that property for myself. And you're representing yourself. And by the way, when you do that, make sure you put somewhere in your contract document that you are a licensed agent. You'd be surprised at how many times we see files like that where the agent is not disclosing to all the parties involved that they're a licensee. With that issue aside, if you're going to purchase the property for yourself and the seller is not represented, clarify one way or the other. You are representing the seller or you're not. The seller is representing himself, that's fine, but make sure you have a notice of non-agency signs acknowledging that he's not being represented by you. And by the way, you should not be giving the seller the disclosures that they need to fill out to give to you if you are not representing, because that could form an implied agency, even if you're saying you're not representing. They can go, they are free to go to the the SAR store, and they can buy those forms in the SAR store. They'll sell them to the public. Okay. You give them your form that has your name on the bottom of it. That's an implied agency. And even if it didn't have your name on it, when he's getting his deposition done, Mr. Seller, where did you get those forms to fill out? Oh, the buyer, is also his own agent. Buyer gave it to you. Well, you're on that path to forming an implied agency. All right. So anyway, think about the optics of what you do. That'll help you stay out of it.
In that case, you hand them the disclosures. You have them sign an addendum.
No. You should not be giving them the disclosures.
In the case that you do.
In the case that you don't.
But on your end, as the buyer's agent, we have our disclosures that we need to have the seller sign. So we can send those.
Yeah,
If you're buying the property.
yes, you can. You can send the. Answer you asked me.
Yeah, we got a question online. So,
Oh, go ahead.
Teresa wants to know, how do you get the proper disclosure signed if the seller is representing themselves?
How do you get the proper disclosures signed? If you're talking about the required disclosures that the seller needs to do, you can direct that seller to the SAR store and they can buy a disclosure package there.
In the case you're the buyer and you don't care about the disclosures.
In the case of the buyer, you're still going to, are you talking about where you're the actual
I'm
buyer?
buying the property from you. You're my seller. You're the seller, not representing. I'm buying your property.
Yeah.
And I'm not.
No, if you're the buyer, are you being represented?
I'm representing myself in purchase. You're the seller, right?
Yeah.
You say, hey, I'm not going down to SAR and do the disclosures. I said, I don't really care, buying it anyway. What do we do in that scenario? Is there where they don't have to disclose anything?
No, California law, civil code requires that they do TDS, SP3, whatever. They have to do that stuff. If you're gonna buy the home and not require them to do that, to give you those disclosures, shame on you.
I'm just curious.
I
Hear what you're saying.
So, Bruce, in the case of where you have a home that's being sold as is. So, in other words, what I believe it says, that you're selling a home that is not necessarily have to do some of these disclosures.
Yeah, you do. Well, California law says that all sales in California are as is sales subject to full disclosure to a buyer of any material value. So even if you're doing it as is sale, the seller still has to make a full and accurate disclosure to a buyer. There's no getting around that. There's some exceptions for REO sales and things of that nature, but there's no, for the average seller, there's no exemption for completing a TDS or whatever, just because they're stating it as is.
If it's been a rental,
If it's been a rental, they still have to make the disclosure. They state on the TDS that they've never occupied the property. There's certain exemptions if it's in a trust and the trust is revocable. It's not a revocable trust. It's not a natural person, so on and so forth. Sometimes corporation properties. And then they might rather than do a TDS and an SPP, they might do an exempt seller disclosure. But for the most part, sellers have to make a disclosure, even if it's an as-is sale, even if it's rental. There is no getting around that.
Question is,
Yeah.
So if somebody were to completely do a full CR on the property, and then they did the disclosures a day later and they see something on it that they don't like, they can back out, bring clear.
Yeah, there's a 5-day right of rescission, that goes into play.
And that automatically falls off after the 5 days if the buyer does not back up.
Now, I'm gonna try, I need to try to get through a lot of material here and I'm running out of time because the forms are gonna take me a while. So, I guess ongoing, any further questions, save them until the end or see me offline and I'll be happy to answer.
You're done with the slides?
Yeah. Oh, you did one. Thank you. All right. No.
No, not there yet?
No, not there yet. I have another slide on the risk management.
And my hand is.
Next one. Yeah. All right, home warranties. A lot of you guys are really good, seeing it in your files. You know, building in a home warranty on the purchase agreement, whether it's paid for the seller, whether it's paid for by the seller, paid for by the buyer. This is really, really important. Number one, it keeps our E&O premiums down. If you include a home warranty in the contract. But B, home warranties help keep us out of court.
Wasn't the question.
Home warranties help keep us out of court. In addition to helping to keep us out of court, when you represent a buyer and you close escrow on the deal, and all of a sudden, it's like every week something is going wrong with something in the house. And the buyers, who are now the owners, have simply taken advantage of their home warranty plan and they just call, Yvonne, they don't call Yvonne, they call Fidelity. And I know this happens because I've closed on deals before where in a month, I got 3 separate postcards from Fidelity talking about a claim being filed on the house. When you have a situation where stuff goes wrong like that, and your clients have had the ability to get an expensive repair taken care of with a small deductible or trip call through that warranty company, that is huge. Number one, it keeps you insulated a little bit more from allegations that maybe the seller failed to disclose something. But it also helps cement that relationship between you and your buyer. Because they will remember that you talked about the importance of them getting a home warranty. And then they see the social proof, how much it's helped them since they closed escrow. So whatever you do on your contracts, and if it were me and I'm representing a buyer, I'm gonna write it into the contract that the buyer is paying for a home warranty or that the seller is paying for a home warranty. I'm not gonna give them the option of saying no, it's just gonna be there. And that way, more often than not, you will get a home warranty after closing. My own personal experience years ago, I bought a townhouse in Pacifica. I bought a home warranty with it. It was with Fidelity. At the end of the first year, I decided to renew the home warranty. I hadn't had any claim, but I renewed it for, I think at that time it was $150 or something. And literally within 2 months of renewing it, my furnace went out. And I'll be damned if Fidelity didn't come out and replace my furnace. They do work, and for a new homeowner, they may not have as much expendable cash anymore. That's a huge deal. I talked about this briefly before. Do a CMA for your client. It doesn't matter if you're representing the seller or a buyer. If you're representing a seller, chances are you went on a listing presentation. If you go on a listing presentation, I would be willing to bet the majority of you are putting together a market analysis. Take that market analysis, show it to your seller, bring an extra copy for them, do whatever you need to do, have them initial or sign that they received it. And then take that CMA and upload it into Command into a transaction file. That CMA is your proof that you are not underselling or overselling property. And by the way, it does not impede you from pricing it lower than what the CMA says, because it may very well be that listing strategy, when you list the house, is, depending on the market, is to price it a little bit below fair market value in order to get competitive bidding. But if you're gonna do that, just explain it, have something on your file where you are explaining that or discussing your conversation with the seller. That was your strategy, and that explains why you have listed the property at, less or substantially less than the fair market value as shown by the comps. If you're representing a buyer, same thing goes. You're writing an offer for a buyer on a property. If you may be in a situation like we had in, the summer of 2020, where you're facing 20, 30, 40 offers on the property, and you're trying to get your client into it, so you're offering well above the fair market value. And, you're removing contingencies up front and doing all sorts of stuff, which has been discussed with your client as to why you're doing that. But do a market analysis, have it put into your file, have it initialed by your client, so they know that even if you're putting an offer in at 450,000, where the property is only valued at 400,000, this is why you're doing it. Have it in your file. It shows that you've done your due diligence. It shows that you've exercised your fiduciary duty, and your client can no longer make a valid claim that you were just in it for the money, you were trying to raise the amount of your commission that you were getting, or you were trying to make it easier to sell the property so you could get your commission, which those are not unusual tactics that we hear about. So keep that in mind. Do a CMA for your client and for yourselves. Full and complete disclosures. This is the thing that gets us into court for those. That results in claims and E&O payouts and all the stuff that goes with it. On the listing side, make sure you impart to your seller before they complete their disclosure, how important it is for them to be honest and disclose everything. And what typically happens where the sellers get into trouble is they fill out a disclosure, you get it under contract, turn that disclosure over to the buyer, or those disclosures over to the buyer, closes escrow, and then the first winter comes along and there's torrential rainstorm. And all of a sudden, you've got water puddling outside the front garden window in the front of the house, and the water starts seeping through into the living room there. And the now owner is out in front of the house in the rain, and he's putting up sandbags trying to keep any more rain from coming in. And the neighbor walks up to him and says, "Hey Joe, how you doing today? Boy, I thought Mr. Seller took care of that problem 2 years ago." And of course, there's nothing in the disclosures about, flooding, rain damage, anything like that. Guess who's going to get sued? Not just going to be the seller, it's going to be the listing agent, the brokerage, maybe even the buyer's agent. Because they like to throw everybody into the mix, let it sort out who's going to pay. So it's really important. Get those disclosures done correct and accurately and completely by the seller when you list the property. On the buyer side, you're representing the buyer, make sure your AVIDs are complete. Don't just phone those things in. I can tell you, I auditing files on a regular basis. It's really funny, and I like to do this exercise every now and then. Well, I will look at the listing agent's AVID, and then I'll pull up the buyer's agent's AVID. And it is absolutely mind-boggling how the listing agent has this full and complete AVID completed, and the buyer's AVID is full of nothing to report, nothing to report, nothing to report. Or they will list things that you might be able to see on a photo of, meaning they never actually went to the property and performed their diligent inspection that the civil code required. So the whole reason, if you don't know it, that we do AVIDs, that the state requires us to do a diligent visual inspection, is because You guys are the experts. You deal with properties all day long. Buyer of the property, they may have some experience, but more often than not, they don't buy a lot of homes in their lifetime. And you're the one that is more suited than anybody. You're going through a house and you see something. You are the one to recognize where there's potential issues. So the state has kind of said, look, we don't want you to climb on the roof, we don't want you to crawl under the house, but we want you to walk around the house and with your eyes, whatever you see that could potentially be a material issue for a buyer, we want you to write that down. Just give that buyer an extra set of piece of information other than what they get from a home inspector or pest inspector or sewage inspector, something like that. The last point here, third-party disclosures. If you learn of a material fact from a third party, maybe the seller doesn't know about it, but a neighbor tells you, you learn about it from the neighbor. You can always, and you should always, draft what we call a third-party disclosure. What is a third-party disclosure? Right on the top of the document, third-party disclosure, and you write, I am buyer's real estate agent, or I am seller's real estate agent with, KW Sac Metro, whatever it is. And I was informed by a neighbor 2 doors down from the subject property on May 31st at 11 a.m. that the County of Sacramento is considering acquiring this property, subject property, through eminent domain in order to widen the street. You don't know for certain it's true, but you were told this by somebody, and it's something important. And by the way, this is one of those things that you should not be researching for your client. You can point them in the right direction, but you should not be doing the research. But you should be disclosing this as something they should take under consideration and advisement, maybe research. That's a third-party disclosure. Kind of extreme. The reason I thought about the whole eminent domain thing is I don't even know if they're still talking about it, but there was a point where on Elkhorn, they were talking about acquiring all the homes on one side of Elkhorn Boulevard in a certain area and raising them in order to widen the road. So that's that. Also, I think, at least in my discussions, there seems to be a disconnect with what people believe that E&O insurance actually covers. Everybody kind of goes through their transactions all year long, and they have this kind of, oftentimes they have this kind of attitude that, I heard that it's not if I get sued, it's going to be planned, which isn't necessarily true. It can be implement common sense practices in the business. But they think, well, if I do get sued, I've got to. Well, it's true, you do have errors and omissions. But the very nature of E&O, errors and omissions, that's exactly what it's for. It's you make a mistake, you forget to do something. That's what E&O insurance is meant to cover. It is meant to cover professional negligence. And that's a legal term of art. Professional negligence occurs when a professional, i.e. somebody with a license, fails to fulfill their professional duties or obligations that they were hired by their clients to do. And there are certain elements that make up a claim of negligence. There's a duty, you have a duty of care to do something that's required by your license. You have a breach of that duty. You fail to do it. You have causation, and that's actual and proximate. I don't need to explain those to you. And then you have damages. You have all of those elements together, there's a claim of negligence. What E&O doesn't protect against are criminal acts, fraud, criminal fraud, larceny, things along those lines. If you're being accused of that, an E&O insurer is not going to pay a claim for you. They might represent you and us long enough to determine that what you did isn't covered by At that point, you're gonna be on your own if you have actually committed criminal fraud or theft or something like that. It also does not protect you or me or anybody else against what are called intentional torts. Intentional torts are civil law, but there are things like fraud and deceit, trespass to land, trespass to chattel, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, things like that. So I talked about criminal violations of fraud, which would be covered. If you, for example, you're getting ready to list a house and the seller has concerns about the roof, and with or without the seller's knowledge, you go and you contact roof doctors. And roof doctors comes out and looks at the house and says, you gotta be kidding, this roof is trash. It needs to be replaced. That's what's in their report. And then you list that home. You go on the market, you find a buyer, you sell that property, and you do not convey that inspection report to the buyer, to the buyer's side. That is tortious fraud. Okay. The only question is, you committed it, which means the broker's liable also. But also, question is, was the seller involved in it? Did they commit it? Did they know about it? Okay. So that's the kind of thing that if it's proven to be an intentional tort or a criminal act, is not going to be covered. It's meant to cover negligence, accidents, things of that sort. So keep that in mind when you're conducting your business. And for those of you who talked to me about this before, you'll know this is one of my favorites. Don't do your clients' permitting or zoning research. When clients have questions about, whether, if I buy this 4-acre plot of vacant land, can I build an apartment building on it? You should not be going down to the city or county permit office and asking those questions, getting answers through some clerk at a desk, and then conveying those answers to your client to rely on. Doesn't matter, what the situation is. Anything that involves permitting, zoning, land use, things of that nature. If you want to give your client the address of the city or county office to go to, if you want to get in a car with them and drive with them and be with them while they ask the questions, that's fine. But you should not be the conduit between that building department, code enforcement, or whatever, and your client. Because if you make a mistake in translation, or if that clerk sitting behind the desk at the office gave you wrong information, and you're playing telephone with the buyer, and you gave the buyer that information, whether it's the same as what they told you or not, if it's wrong, you're going to be liable. So don't do it. Stay within your lane. You're a real estate licensee. You help people buy and sell houses. Don't do research on construction, zoning, any of that stuff. Just like we don't give tax advice, we don't give legal advice. Stay in your lane. You'll stay safe. Email signatures. This was a new one. I just saw recently in a legal update. I thought I'd pass it along. Essentially, what's been happening is there have been a couple of court cases where they've said that an email signature block name or email address can be from section of the email can be considered a valid signature. And I'm not talking about a DocuSign. I'm talking about an actual email that's transmitted from you to somebody else. So what they recommend if you want to avoid this, I'm not requiring this, I'm just throwing this out there, it's food for thought. Put a footer on your emails, something along the lines of emails sent and received shall not create a binding contract acceptance of an offer until the written contract is signed by all parties, just to make it clear.
Did you say that again?
Right there, just take a picture.
And actually, you'll have access to a link where you can have the entire presentation. Oops, I'm sorry.
Is there an actual story where somebody actually,
What?
is there an actual example of where they took?
There's actually a couple of cases on point. It's happening. This one here, how many of you know what fire love letters?
You know.
Yeah, good, all right. Is there anybody that doesn't? All right, cool. So fire love letters are, it's a nice trick that buyer's agents have used for a number of years now. I used one myself when I purchased a property in the Bay Area, and it worked. I didn't have the best offer. Essentially what it is buyer's agents will work with the buyer. They maybe get a photo of the buyer and their family, and they combine it with a nice little letter about how much this is their dream home. This is the home they want to raise their children in. You know, they love the customs and work done in the family room and this and that and the other and blah, 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 blah. And essentially it's sent over to the listing agent with the buyer's offer. Now, in concept, when I first heard about this, I had trouble because in concept, I couldn't imagine what could be wrong with it. And as I said, I've used it myself. I bought a home in the Bay Area 20-something years ago, and it was a very competitive market. Six buyers were trying to bid on this property. My offer was written with no contingencies, no appraisal, no loan, no inspection contingencies, no nothing. And it included a buyer letter with a picture of our family and my young toddler son, Daniel, who actually signed his name saying how much he wants to live in the property. And we didn't have the highest offer. We did not have the highest offer. And so they can work. And my old business partner and I, she was great working with buyer clients, put together these buyer love letters. And I have to think they help a lot of our clients get into home. The problem is, and this is, where my narrow thinking didn't occur to me. The problem is, buyer letters can be descriptive of the family's protected status, meaning, let's just say your buyer clients are an African-American family. And the seller has some concealed racist tendency. He doesn't like Black people. And let's just say there's more than one offer on the property, and all things being equal, the offers were basically the same amount of money, but one was from a white family and one is from a Black family. And the seller decides, well, I don't like Black people, I'm going to take the white family. Then you get into a whole fair housing problem. And whether the seller is a racist or isn't a racist, it really doesn't matter. He may not have been a racist, but because he liked a description in the white family's letter of their family and what they plan to do with the home better than the other family, just by taking the white family's offer, the presumption is that they were racist. And so, fair housing is still a huge problem in California. A lot of people are discriminated against based on various categories, not just race, but there's a whole series of categories. And in order to get around this, the state and CAR have worked together, and they've agreed that these buyer love letters are not a good thing. In the long run, they're a bad thing. And so if you've read your residential listing agreement, you will have seen that there's a section in there now on buyer love letters or buyer letters. And essentially it describes what they are, and it says it's notice to the seller. The default is that you are not going to submit buyer letters to the seller along with the offers. And B, you are authorized to put in the MLS that you're not going to accept buyer letters from agents. But the form That's what the form defaults to. It also gives the seller the option of checking a box and saying, I don't care about the great advice you're giving me. I'm going to overrule you and I'm checking this box and I want to see buyer letters. So if that's the case, you must tender those to the seller. But they've been duly warned, they've been told what the problems are and how it can create liability for a fair housing allocation. And you've done everything you can to try to protect them and you from that. Code of ethics. I wanted to include one template on this. Complaints are on the rise. And, this is like, I mentioned earlier with legal complaints against agents. They happen, they tend to increase when markets become challenging. Same with the code of ethics complaints. For those of you who don't know, and most of you I know have never had to experience this, but we are a realtor shop, which means that we all agree to abide by the realtor code of ethics. And, I know John Lanting sits on grievance. No, you're on pro standards now. Yeah.
You're on Pro Standards.
John and I had both previously been on grievance committee where we would receive complaints from other agents. And the task of the grievance committee is based on the allegations on the face that are included in that complaint. If everything is true, was there a violation of the realtor code of ethics? And if there was, then that complaint gets sent up to pro standards for a hearing, a tribunal. And that's where 3 members of pro standards, me, John, and somebody else, there's numerous pro standards members, we will sit and we will hear evidence from the complainant and the respondent, and we will make a determination as to whether or not a violation of the code occurred. And if it did occur, there are some instances where warnings and fines can be, small fines, citations can be issued. But there's also the potential for up to, I think it's 15,000 in financial fines. And you get your face posted on the CAR website, a mugshot, along with a description of how you have violated the code of ethics. That's out there for every real estate agent to see when they're doing business. That'll stay there for years.
If there's multiple offenders by somebody, do they have to put their picture twice?
Yes.
Asking for.
And I'm sure that's not something that you want to be faced with. And, what I would encourage you to do, the code of ethics has numerous chapters and subsections to it. I would encourage you to Google NAR code of ethics and just read through the standards of practice that are listed. And you will have an idea of what you can and can't do in your real estate business, things that would be considered unethical. And I'm not talking about necessarily things that are violations of real estate law. Real estate law and the code of ethics are 2 different things, but there are things that are against the law and are punishable by DRE, which also are code of ethics violations. So, but they're not mutually exclusive. All right. I think that is it. And we're ready, Vince, to go to the documents. You're going to control the. So what we have here so far this year, these are the new documents we'll be going through, as well as changes to existing documents that have been implemented. Now, I have got one. Looks like maybe 20 or so new forms and changed documents that I'm going to go through with you guys. You are going to have access to a copy of this. Vince, if you can scroll down a little bit for me. You hit the yellow. There you go. What I've done on this form is I've kind of made some notes on it, and highlighted some important things, or actually a lot of them aren't even important. They're just changes that have been added by CAR. But I wanted to point out the differences. So for example, on the first page of the RPA, you can see that there's no longer a default for points that the seller is paying towards the loan or for additional finance. If you want to ask for that and you're representing a buyer, you can just throw in a number. Doesn't default anything. Going on to page 2, they added a new section 3, section G3, and basically that one it's for buyer to use. Right, in order for the buyer to use it, ask the seller to pay for their buyer broker. In cases where you have a buyer broker agreement, by the way, that is changing. Get into that. When you have a buyer broker agreement in place, this little section will allow you to use a form SPVD. Check that box, use form SPVD, and ask the seller to pay the buyer broker, or what the buyer is going to be paying the buyer broker. For most transactions, if they're in Metro List and there's a commission being advertised, you're not even going to need to worry about this. But as we advance in the state of California and come into compliance with some court decisions and Department of Justice rulings that will be coming down in the future, buyer broker agreements will be coming into vogue. And when that happens, or in advance of that happening, I'll be putting together a class, kind of go through the intricacies of those with you guys. So it'll be a little bit more familiar to you than actually happen. If you go down to M3, that refers to the units occupied by persons other than the seller. And if you look over to the far right, they've added this last column that says seller shall disclose to the buyer if occupied by tenants or persons other than the seller, and they're required to attach a TOPA form. And if it wasn't attached in here, there's going to have to be a counteroffer to get that TOPA form added. Moving on to page 5 of 16. Closing and possession. They added new language that provides that if the unit buyer intends to occupy the property, it's going to be vacant at possession for delivery. And I mean, subtle change, but obviously important if you're representing a buyer and they plan to occupy the property as attached. Moving on to page 6 of 16. Items included in sale. Basically, what they did here is they added their 9B2. They added window coverings that include hardware and rods. They are included if they were there at contract acceptance. If you're listing an property, you need to make sure that you make it clear in your counteroffer to the contract if your seller does not want the curtains and rods, hardware included. You want to specify that, make it clear, so that at close of escrow, there is not an argument that by default they were supposed to. Moving on to page 9. This is one of my favorite ones. They came out recently with the solar one, which is one of the new ones. Before that darn solar form, there were so many questions that agents on both sides had. It's a solar system. But they added this, they added that form, and they associated it with the purchase contract. It basically requires the seller to give the buyer known information about their solar. Solar form does that very well. Happy that's it. Under 12B3, there's a paragraph making review of the seller docs part of the entire investigation. And they removed that. So now, review of the seller docs is now its own. You may have noticed that already. But I think that was a great decision by the CAR lawyers. Because we kind of grouped the investigation all into one big bundle. Now it's separated out for buyer's opportunity or contingency to review the seller document.
Hey, Bruce,
Yes.
quick question. Going back to the compensation up on, I think it's G1, is that correct? G3. So, yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
So with that particular new piece, is that if it's an MLS that they're paying 2.5% being offered to the buyer, is that something you've got to have filled out, or
No.
how does that work?
No, you don't need this form filled out at all. If there's an offer of compensation referenced in the MLS, and if you're a member of that MLS.
Okay.
Yeah, this form is irrelevant.
So basically, they've added it to, from what I'm hearing, is
They added this form. What it could be, the way you could use it, if that were the case, if you had a SPVB form filled out with your buyer where they're agreeing to compensate you already, then you would, in that instance, and I know a lot of agents don't use buyer brokers, but if you are using one and you have one, then you check that box under G3 and you add that form. And there's another form that we'll get to where you clarify that the seller is actually going to be paying the commission. And it also states that you basically can't get double payment. It limits you to what the seller's offer of compensation in the MLS is.
so they're kind of just adding it for possible future things as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, going back to page 12 of 16, item 23. They just simply added language here requiring the parties to notify escrow assignment. That's not going to be a common occurrence, but they added it into the contract. Page 16 of 16. You'll notice here, and hopefully already been using these, they have these boxes marked designated electronic delivery addresses. Check all that apply. You can do your email address that's above. You can do text the phone. You can do an alternate, however, whatever contact you use. Essentially, what this is, though, is if you put electronic delivery information address on this form, on the offer, as your contact information, there is a presumption that the moment the other agent, Bill, can you please turn it off? There's a presumption that the moment the other agent sends you a document, whether you actually get it or not, you have received it. Okay. So, you know, if you've got, you know, you're having problems with your email, you're not getting emails that are sent to you, or you're not getting text messages or voicemails or anything like that, you probably don't want to check that box. But if your systems are all good and working, all right. Moving on to the next form. Oh, you're already there. Damn, Vince, way ahead of me. This is a new form, brand spanking new. It's called a buyer representation and broker compensation. And essentially, what this form did, so, and CAR considers this a significant addition to your article form. It replaced the exclusive buyer representation agreement form, that was the BRE. It also replaced the non-exclusive buyer representation form, the BRNE, and it replaced the not for compensation buyer representation agreement, which is BRNN. Completely wiped those guys out. They're no longer there. Under this new form, there is no, they don't give you an option of not for compensation. You have to have some compensation. Additionally, paragraph 1 of this form notes that the buyer representation period will only last for a number of days, for the number of days specified. So rather than a certain date, it has a number of days. Under paragraph 4B1, the form assumes that there's going to be a non-exclusive representation, entitling the broker to compensation only when there was broker involvement in the purchase of the property. Paragraph 4B2 creates an optional exclusive representation period, which would entitle the broker to compensation on the buyer's purchase of the property during the representation with or without the broker's help. Paragraph 4C gives either the buyer or the broker the right to cancel the agreement. One holdover from the 3 forms that were killed, the BRE, the BRNE, and the BRNN, is in 4D1. And that paragraph credits, I kind of mentioned this before, that paragraph credits against the buyer's compensation obligation any payments to the broker from the seller's broker or from the seller. Additionally, 4D3 authorizes the broker to include a term asking for the seller to pay the buyer's broker. And finally, under 4F, an obligation is imposed on the buyer's broker to disclose any compensation the broker expects to receive from others on a particular property, and an obligation to disclose any compensation the broker actually ends up receiving. So if you look at this form, section 4 has all sorts of different ways that you can be compensated, whether it's from your buyer, from the seller, from the seller's agent. It also has cancellation provisions that can be put in there. And it also provides for disclosure to your client and everybody else who's compensating you and by how much.
If you scroll up to E real quick, I'm just referencing something here that we see on line 3, on D3, authorization to include commission in offer. Right now that we have that offer checkbox in there where the seller can pay for it, but right there it says buyer authorizes or does not authorize broker to include a term in the buyer's offer with obligating seller to pay broker. Basically saying that your buyer, if they check that box, say, hey, you know what, I'm going to cover you. That commission in the MLS can then be credited back to the seller to make their offer stand out.
And it be credited back.
That, let's say on average, right, 2.5%. Instead of checking that box in the RPA, your buyer says, hey, no, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to pay you 2.5%. You already agreed on your love. I'm going to cover that. That's going to make my offer stand out. If we don't have the seller required to pay that, the agent can choose to pay back the seller on that 2.5% credit.
I know for a fact.
I'd rather take 5%.
I know for a fact, Rich Gibbons, that you know you. So, yeah, you can do that.
I do know that.
For those of you who aren't aware, as a real estate professional, you are legally authorized to rebate a portion or all of your commission to your client in the transaction, as well as the other agent's client, if that will help make the deal viable. You're not limited to rebating to your own client. Formulate a deal that also rebates to the other party in the contract, as Rich can attest. Can I move on?
Yeah, I was just verifying that. But if they check that box and the seller's still offering 2.5%, your buyer's paying, you're just like, we made one of the listing agent.
There are some issues, and we have to talk about it on a case by case basis. There are some issues about the
Being more, getting compensated over the 2.5% you agree with the buyer.
yeah.
Got it.
So we can talk about that. All right, moving on to the next form, which is another new form called the cancellation of buyer representation. This code name for this is COBR. This is where the buyer or broker gives notice of cancellation to the other. So the COBR, it's a new form. Functionally, there's two parts to it. Part one provides.
We're on the BTA.
Yeah, transactional advisory after that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have.
Well. All right. So you,
BTA.
BTA, all right, hang on a second. BTA. All right. Scratch everything I just said. All right, BTA, Buyer Transactional Advisor. This is another one of those new forms I was talking about. This is a new form. It's intended to help buyers. It may prove to be an excellent risk management tool. The BTA is bundled with the new BRBC form, and it outlines the responsibilities and limits of the agents and responsibility and limits of the agents and buyers respectively. The purpose of the form is to provide buyers with more information concerning the buyer-agent relationship, what the buyer's obligations are with the agents and just clarifies that. All right, where is my next one? Anticipated.
It's the ABCD form.
What? All right, the anticipated broker compensation disclosure, another new form. Right, they had their attorneys working overtime for this. What was that? So this is a new form. It facilitates some of the changes that we talked about in the new BRBC form, which, as I described, deleted the BRE, BRNE, and BRNN form. This ABCD form puts together the broker disclosures required under paragraph 4F of the BRBC. Part 1 of this form, there's a new advisory to the buyer that any compensation to the buyer broker through the seller or through the seller's broker, quote, may impact the price the seller will accept, end quote. Part 1 also notes the obligation of the buyer broker to reveal promised compensation on a property by property basis. And then part 3 of this form provides a portion where the broker discloses the actual compensation they receive. In other words, everything is out in the open, full light of day, no concealment whatsoever. Everyone's going to know what you're making. There's no way around that. No question, Rick?
We're going.
All right, what's my next one? Cancellation of buyer. Oh, I think I'm back in the correct order. There you go. All right. So cancellation of buyer representation, another new form. This form is to be used where either the buyer or broker can give notice of the cancellation of the representation. There's actually 2 parts to the form. Part 1 provides the notice of the cancellation requiring a signature. Part 1 identifies any outstanding compensation that is due to the buyer's broker. And portion of paragraph 3A relates back to the BRBC form that we've already discussed and applies to any applicable property or to any property where broker involvement can be identified. The form notes multiple valid forms of just compensation, including, quote, just expenses incurred, which is 3B, broker receiving a referral fee, 3C, broker getting paid from the seller, 3D, or no compensation at all, 3E. So gives you lots of different options to choose from, depending on how you want to use it, and what your agreement is with your buyer.
This is only for the buyer broker, right?
Yeah. Um,
Paragraph, are we on the same one?
yeah, you already covered that. Notice of buyer involved property, that's our next. All right, so you might be familiar with your listing agreements. On your listing agreements, there is a what I call a protection clause, where you say, if within 90 days, 6 months, 3 months after the expiration of the listing agreement, if somebody who I have introduced to the property comes back and buys the property, you owe me a commission. There is a requirement to exercise that you must have advised the seller at expiration or cancellation of the listing by telling them the names of these potential people and identifying them. There's a specific card form for doing that. This is the buyer broker version of that form. This is so at the termination or end of a buyer broker agreement, you can list the names of properties that you have introduced the buyer to. And if they end up going back, then there's an obligation here. So essentially it says upon the termination of the representation, this form will basically provide a period of protection or within 5 days after either the buyer or broker cancels the BRDC. So this is your protection form used. You have a disagreement with a buyer you're working with. You've shown them the property, and for whatever reason, you have an ugly separation of powers with that buyer. And then they go to another agent, decide they want to put an offer in, and that offer gets accepted. This is what protects you. All right.
Or they call the listing agent and say, yeah. So we have to do that.
Hey, Bruce,
Yes.
quick question for you on these buyer broker and these pieces here. Are they pretty effective? Because you end up having to sue the buyer or settle with the buyer.
I think that's a whole nother discussion, but in general, my feeling is, in this day and age of Yelp and Facebook and all sorts of social media exposure out there,
Yeah.
I would not personally. I'm not telling you. You may want to make that decision to do so, but if you're in this business for the long term, I think you need to have that the real heart-to-heart discussion with yourself and make a business decision. Is it worthwhile to do that? You may win the battle, but you may lose the war in terms of negative publicity that goes out there about you and your business.
Yeah, because I think these are very, again, like another discussion, but I won't even talk on it. But thank you. That's was just curious on that.
Seller payment to buyer's broker. There we go. Okay. This form here is used when there is already a buyer broker. This is a new form. It's used when there's already a buyer broker agreement in place, and this form moves the payment requirement to the seller. That's all this says. And so if 3G3 in the RPA is checked. That's how you would identify the amount of compensation that the buyer is asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker. But again, you can't get both.
I still can't read it. Scroll up to where I can see the, which part? This part, keep going up. I can pull this. Sure.
And again, you'll have access to the wall.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I got the form down slightly.
All right, designated, okay. So in the event that you do your contract and you forget or you decide not to at that time to mark the electronic delivery addresses, this is just, this form facilitates the RPA by providing a designated delivery address for delivery of the documents, or if you needed to make a change after already doing it. Next one. Non-contingent offer advisory, another new form.
Is this going to be mandatory?
When we introduce our new templates, which we're working on now and they will be ready shortly, this will be amended. If you're going to make a non-contingent offer,
Only me.
yeah. Non-contingent offer advisory, again, new form. It notifies the buyer of the risk of making offers without contingency. Further, in order to make sure the buyer is fully informed, the form provides a description of the contractual value of having a loan contingency or appraisal contingency or an investigation contingency in place. Just one more piece of disclosure to the inexperienced, unknowing amateur home buyer who's buying perhaps what is the largest transaction they would ever make in their life. Worth an additional piece of paper for them, and it's worth an additional piece of paper for us. And then I'm sure most of you have seen the solar advisory. Damn, James, you're way ahead of me. Solar advisory, I love this form. I think it's a terrific tool.
So John wants to know, will this form be required if any of the contingencies are waived upfront or only if all contingencies?
Any contingency waived up front. That clear, John?
But you're also on the,
He said yes.
also on the purchase agreement, you're checking that box saying that you're waiving that contingency. So
Yeah.
will it populate that document if you do that?
I don't know if it will actually populate that document, but if it doesn't, make sure you get that document. Usually the way CAR has developed the intermix them into zip forms. And I'm sure somebody in here has got to have written an offer where you're waiving some contingency in the last month or so. If that's the case, can anybody provide feedback to that? Did it offer that non-contingent offer advisory? Did it put that into your packet? No, nobody knows. So if it doesn't, add it. Solar advisory and questionnaire. Again, this is a new form this year. First page of it basically is all about solar systems. Tells you all about them, both the seller and the buyer. The form has, two parts. In the first 5 paragraphs, there's an advisory. It discusses the most common types of solar panels and the most common agreements for owning or leasing them. That is how payments for solar setups commonly work. It talks about the different principles of what gets transferred in a real estate purchase. And then there's an advisory on the importance of reviewing all documents and inspecting the system before you actually complete the purchase. The second part of the form has 20 questions for the seller to answer. They have to answer to the best of their knowledge, just like any other disclosure. And it's intended to satisfy a portion of the seller's duties that are expressed now in the RPA, and kind of like that earlier. Rate form and the information that's provided in this form helps both buyer and seller through the transaction in terms of what needs to be done in order to get that system transferred, along with its warranties and so on and so forth.
I just sent that form to the title company, it makes it easier for them, they have that information.
Absolutely. And just a side note, if you're in a transaction, and you're representing a buyer of property that has a solar system, if you don't get this as part of your normal disclosures from the seller, you need to request it. You can even send the listing agent a blank one and request that they get their client to fill it out for you. And that should be returned to your client during their inspection period. All right. Cancellation of contract, disposition of deposit, and cancellation.
Fire channel.
Am I off again?
Yeah.
Fire channel. Wow, I'm really off. Okay. That's it. All right. DCO, they made a couple of changes to the existing form. They added language to 1B stating that the seller credits in the offer remain unchanged, even if the price changes. In 1C, the language is added to clarify that the difference between the offered price and the appraisal contingency amount will remain the same, even if the price changes. It's a subtle change, but nevertheless. All right. Cancellation of contract disposition. Okay. This one, what they did here is they modified the existing form, and because of the modification that they did, they have replaced the old form. It's no longer compatible. But the revision to this form only concerns paragraph 1B. And what it is a proposed mutual cancellation, where the new language sets a time for the recipient to respond. And if the timeline isn't met for proposal, it's then expired. So for those of you who are not aware, when under normal circumstances, you're representing either the seller or the buyer, say you send a notice to reform, or maybe you're sending a demand to close escrow, and that the other side blows through that time period, doesn't respond, it goes to whatever. If your client decides after sending that notice to reform or demand to close escrow, after waiting the statutory period of time that they want to cancel, on a normal cancellation, all that's required on the upper part of this form is that one of the parties, your client, sign as canceled. Does not require signatures of the other party on the other side of the transaction. If either party cancels, it's canceled. That's it. Kaput, end of deal. The exception now, though, is under 1B. If you're proposing a mutual cancellation, on a mutual cancellation, if that box is checked and your client signs there and is sent over to the other side in the transaction, if the other party does not sign under mutual cancellation, it does not cancel. You still have a contract. And what this does now, though, is it has a time period for them to respond by signing. And if they don't respond, then the offer of mutual cancellation disappears. That's what it does.
But you're still in contract.
You're still in contract.
So then why would you do that box? Why wouldn't you just say as
Well,
permitted?
so
by the committee?
sometimes lenders need to get a little kick in the butt to move things forward. And they're not trying to be offensive for the buyers. And
Good point. That's a valid point.
I haven't had this, and I do know I sent notice for form to make sure that the lender knew, hey, you need to get that stuff buttoned up so we can close this. And it's not really, it's less offensive than the notice form, right? It's simple. If you're sending this to your lender, let them know whatever they need to get it done. Really, right? To expedite things.
There are circumstances where one of the choices under cancellation of contract may not be applicable. For example, let's, if the party that is reaching the contract is not reaching it under one of the contingencies, or if they're reaching it under something else that isn't covered there. And so in order to get it canceled, maybe that might be an appropriate use of 1B. The other side doesn't want to go through with the sale, they don't want to go through with the sale, but you don't want to waive any rights that you might have as to their EMD above. So maybe that'd be a circumstance.
So Bruce, in a situation like this, let's just say you send us up, you check the proposed mutual cancellation, they don't respond. It expires, you can always send another one and have a new one, right?
Yeah. Once you send your demand to close escrow or notice to perform, there's no time limit on how long you have.
For sure. That's not fair.
All right. Next one. Extension of permanent.
Oh,
Extension of time amendment. What they did here is they changed it, and I'll explain this in a second, from an addendum to an amendment by adding paragraph 5, which established a time for the recipient party to respond. So for those of you who don't know, an amendment is typically used to change something that's part of the original contract. And it's included as part of the contract ratification. An addendum is used to clarify and add things that were not initially part of the original. And because they added in the time for the recipient party to respond, that changed it from an addendum over to an amendment.
So in your counter offer, if you've been sitting on an offer longer than 3 days, would have had an expiration, say, here's our counter offer, and included in that is the ETA form, the buyer's offer expiration to be extended. to another time.
Could do that. All right, next. So this one, the changes involve page 2. They basically added language incorporating the terms of the existing manufactured home advisory addendum and release, that's the MHA, informing the parties and making contractual requirements for the condition of the mobile home if it's going to be occupied, and that pertains mainly to section 11. This refers to the condition. No big change. Yes. So for those of you who aren't aware, you list who is working with a buyer on a manufactured home. There is a separate TDS form that should be posted. But this form, they just revised the format. They itemized the features in the format to make them flow a little easier. No major changes to the form either. But again, if you're on a mobile home, make sure you use it. Make sure you're going to see it. Yes. Make sure you use it. Residential lease after sale. Yeah. All right. So before I actually get into the changes that they made to the form, I just want to take advantage of this opportunity to express to all of you that we want to avoid using this form. We want to avoid residential leases after the sale. Try to keep any post-closing occupancy by the seller to 29 days or less and use the SIP form. Because in doing so, you're only giving the seller a license to remain in possession, which means if they refuse to get out of the property at the end of that term and your client, your buyer now has to call law enforcement in order to get access to the property. If you've only used an SIP form and only granted them a license for 29 days or less, since they are licensee, law enforcement, if they know what they're doing, can basically remove them from the home and say, get out of here or you're trespassing. If you use this residential lease after sale, you're creating a right to tenancy. And if you're representing a buyer and you put this into the contract because the seller is demanding a term longer than 29 days, and the seller then refuses to leave, your buyer is going to have to evict them. And that might take 3 to 6 months and cost a couple $1,000. So that's my soapbox on this point. Now, as far as the changes that they made, what they
I think from 1 to 29 days, that's just an agreement.
Seller in possession.
there's a form called a seller in possession. And that covers that it's only a license and it is not a lease and it grants them a license to stay in the property for 29 days after, up to 2 years.
Also, quick question, won't FHA and other lenders not even lend on the property if it is?
60 days.
Yeah, I think FHA, the number is 60 days. I don't know about other lenders.
FHA is 60 days.
I'm sure, Rich, VA 60 days too.
So if they already closed escrow and funded, but they don't move out after 60 days, what?
The
Then
Your
then you
lender
don't
is
get
gonna
the loan.
need, the lender and underwriter, you see this form as an RLAS or an SIP under 60 days or less, right? If you have a RLAS longer than that, you have to go to them, right? Now, if you change anything, which I don't recommend, I would just say, keep it here at 60 days and under, that'll get through underwriting.
No, keep it at 29 days or under and use an SIP.
I totally agree with that, I don't like this.
Thank you.
I just.
I just told my buyers to move on to different property.
What was that?
Either wait for it to shorten or have an extended escrow and keep it there if you have it.
Okay, as far as changes to the form. Very little was actually changed on it. What they did is they defined the maximum CAR, defined the maximum security deposit that can be imposed by a buyer against the seller as 2 times the monthly rent. They modified 10A where the seller or tenant acknowledges that the condition of the property was as it was disclosed when the purchase contract was formed. And 14A was modified to state that the seller tenant is not responsible for smoking damage that existed at the lease initiation. But again, if you're a buyer's agent, you should not advocate the client enter into this.
Bruce, may I please?
Yeah.
You do an SIP, 29 days or less, you close escrow. On day 27, it's like, can we have another 45 days? The buyer is perfectly okay with it, you do an addendum. Does that throw you into a lease or are you still?
It's a lease. It has to be less than 29 days.
All right, seller counteroffer. Language was added here. In paragraph 1B, clarifies that the seller credits in the offer remain unchanged even if the purchase price changes. Further, it also changes paragraph 1C, clarifying that the difference between the offer price and the appraisal contingency amount will remain the same, even in the event that the purchase price changes. Older versions of the form are now incompatible with this new update. So if you have any of these older versions that the GC you're using, make sure you get rid of them. They should not be available in this one. Seller multiple counteroffer. They mirrored the changes made to the seller counteroffer. Again, 1B was changed to clarify that the seller credits in the offer may be changed in the event of a purchase price change. Similarly, 1C clarifies the difference between the offer price and the appraisal contingency amounts remain the same in the event of a purchase price change. And does everyone understand the difference between a seller multiple counteroffer form and a seller counteroffer? No, I see a couple head shaking. No, really quickly, I'm being told that I'm running out of time. I only have, this is my last form.
Okay, we do have a night started.
I will be done by then. I don't know. Jeez,
At least.
yeah. All right, so the difference between a regular counteroffer. In a regular counteroffer, if a seller sends the buyer side a counteroffer and says, you know, instead of purchase price to be 300,000, purchase price will be 325,000. So the seller is basically rejecting your offer, and they are sending a new offer to the buyer that says, we don't like 300,000, we want 325. And they are instilling in the buyer the power of acceptance to their counteroffer. So if the buyer wants to accept that offer and form a contract, all the buyer has to do is sign that counteroffer if it's a regular seller counteroffer. Right? The difference with a multiple counteroffer is seller, same deal. And two things. One is the seller may not, say the seller has multiple offers on the table. They send seller multiple counteroffer to the first agent and it says purchase price to be 325,000. They send it out to the second agent that says purchase price to be 350,000. Maybe one of them gave a higher pre-approval. Who knows? These multiple counteroffers cannot be accepted to form a binding contract simply by the buyer signing and saying accept. It requires a counter signature by the seller once received back by the seller in order to form the binding contract. So just know if you get a seller multiple counteroffer, you're on the buy side, your buyer signs it, says we accept. Doesn't mean you have a binding contract until it makes it back to the seller and the seller has the opportunity to countersign it and then send you that signed document. And that's for the seller's protection, so they don't get into a problem where they sell it to more than one party at the same time. That is it for me. I'm getting the bums rushed out of here. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. If you have any questions related to this stuff, please come see me offline or send me an email, send me a call, whatever you want.
And this will be sent out to everybody.
Yeah, Sam will send out the links to everything.
Awesome. Thank you.
Man,